The story of William Wallace begins not in a grand castle or royal court, but in the rugged green hills of 13th century Scotland, a land torn apart by English domination and Scottish division. Born around 1270 near Elderslie, Wallace grew up during one of the darkest times in Scottish history. The Scottish king had died without an heir, and England's powerful ruler, King Edward III, known as Longshanks, seized the opportunity to tighten his grip on Scotland. From a young age, William was taught by his uncle, a priest, who gave him not only an education but a fierce sense of justice. He learned Latin, the art of the sword, and most importantly, the value of freedom. Even as a boy, he refused to bow to English soldiers who patrolled Scottish towns, demanding obedience from the locals. The breaking point came when Wallace, now a young man, killed an English officer who had insulted and humiliated him. That act of defiance marked the beginning of his transformation from a commoner into a symbol of rebellion. He was forced into hiding, moving through forests and hills, gathering others who shared his hatred for English rule. Word of his courage spread like wildfire. Soon, farmers, blacksmiths, and outlaws joined him, forming the first core of what would become the Scottish resistance. By 1297, Wallace had become a legend whispered among the oppressed. He led his men in daring ambushes, attacking English garrisons and freeing towns from occupation. His most famous early victory came at Lanark, where he struck against English forces in a surprise attack that shocked the region. To the English, he was a criminal, a traitor. To the Scots, he was becoming a hero. But Wallace's rebellion wasn't only about vengeance. It was about something far greater, the soul of a nation. He fought not for power or wealth, but for freedom, something no English crown could give or take away. His belief in independence was unshakable, and that faith began to inspire even the highest Scottish nobles who had once submitted to Edward's rule. As the rebellion grew, so did the danger. English patrols scoured the countryside for him. They burned villages that harbored his men, executed suspected rebels, and spread terror to crush the rising movement. But Wallace's resolve only hardened. He began planning something bolder, an open confrontation with the English army itself. That plan would lead him to the banks of the River Forth, near a small wooden bridge at a place called Stirling. There, in one of the most remarkable battles in Scottish history, William Wallace would prove that courage and cunning could defeat even the mightiest empire on earth. The morning of September 11th, 1297, dawned cold and misty over the River Forth. A thick fog rolled across the water, muffling the sounds of the English camp on the opposite bank. Thousands of heavily armed soldiers waited there, knights in gleaming armor, archers, infantry, banners fluttering in the damp wind. At their head stood Hugh de Cressingham and John de Warenne, two of King Edward's finest commanders. Their goal was simple: crush the rebellion once and for all and capture the outlaw who dared defy the English crown, William Wallace. Across the narrow wooden bridge stood Wallace, commanding a far smaller army. Farmers, shepherds, and blacksmiths turned warriors. His men had no shining armor, no fine horses, and little formal training. Yet their spirits burned brighter than steel. Wallace, standing tall and broad-shouldered, wore not the attire of a nobleman, but the rough garb of the common folk. To his followers, he wasn't just their leader, he was Scotland itself. The English believed this would be an easy victory. They outnumbered the Scots nearly 3-1. Their knights mocked the rebels across the river, laughing at their ragged clothes and crude weapons. But Wallace was no fool. He had studied the terrain, the bridge, the movement of troops. He knew that brute force alone could not win, only strategy. He waited patiently as the English began crossing the narrow bridge, 2 men abreast, slow and clumsy under the weight of their armor. The river's current churned below, fast and merciless. Wallace gave no signal yet. He let them come, a few dozen, then hundreds, until the bridge sagged under their weight. Then, with a sudden cry that tore through the fog, Wallace unleashed his men. The Scots charged from hiding, roaring like thunder. Archers rained arrows from the hills, while pikemen rushed the bridge, cutting down anyone who dared cross. The English front ranks panicked. Those on the bridge had nowhere to go, trapped between the fury ahead and the river behind. Wallace's men hacked the bridge apart, sending dozens of armored knights plunging into the cold, swirling water. Horses screamed, metal clashed, and the river ran red with blood. The English army broke. Those who survived the crossing were slaughtered in the marshes beyond. It was chaos, glorious, shocking chaos. When the mist cleared, the battlefield belonged to Wallace. Against impossible odds, he had annihilated one of the greatest armies in Europe. News of the victory spread across the land like wildfire. The English retreated in fear, and the Scots, for the first time in generations, felt the taste of true freedom. Wallace's triumph at Stirling Bridge transformed him from rebel to legend. He was soon named Guardian of Scotland, a title that placed him at the head of the nation's armies. But while the victory brought hope, it also brought danger. King Edward would not rest. He would return, with an army even larger and more ruthless than before. Wallace knew it. He looked out over the blood-stained fields and said quietly to his men, "This is not the end. It is only the beginning." The year was 1297. Scotland bled. Villages were burned, men hanged, women taken, and the English banners of King Edward I, the Iron Hammer, fluttered over once free lands. Yet from the ashes of despair, a flame began to rise. That flame bore a name that would echo through centuries: William Wallace. After the brutal murder of his wife Marion at the hands of English soldiers, Wallace became something greater than a man. He became a symbol, a silent oath of vengeance. With every raid, every ambush, his legend grew. The English began to whisper his name with fear. The Scots spoke it with hope. Wallace gathered a small band of loyal men, outlaws, farmers, blacksmiths, and even monks. They were not soldiers. They were sons of the soil, men who had lost everything but their will to fight. His first victory came at Lanark, where he struck swiftly, punishing the English garrison responsible for Marion's death. It wasn't just revenge, it was rebellion. Word spread fast. Every hill and glen carried tales of a tall warrior clad in rough wool and steel, his eyes burning with fury. He became the rallying cry of the oppressed. Men left their plows and took up arms. For the first time in years, Scotland began to believe that freedom wasn't a dream. It was a battle to be won. Then came Stirling Bridge. The English, confident in their numbers and arrogance, marched to crush the uprising. They had thousands of men, infantry, archers, and heavy cavalry. Wallace, with far fewer warriors, knew brute force wouldn't win the day. He needed cunning. As the English army began to cross the narrow wooden bridge over the River Forth, Wallace waited. The English thought the Scots were retreating, but Wallace was watching, calculating. When half the enemy had crossed, he struck like lightning. "Now is the time," he roared. His men surged forward, cutting off the bridge's exit. Trapped and unable to maneuver, the English soldiers fell into chaos. Arrows rained, swords clashed, and horses screamed as they plunged into the river. In mere hours, the might of England had been shattered by the brilliance of a single man's strategy. When the dust settled, the Scottish banners flew high. The river ran red, and William Wallace was hailed as Guardian of Scotland. Songs were sung, and for the first time, the people dared to smile. Freedom had a face, and it was his, but Wallace knew victory came with a price. The English king would not forgive such humiliation. The war was far from over. It was only beginning. Yet standing on the battlefield, drenched in blood and rain, Wallace looked to the northern hills and whispered the vow that defined his soul. "They may take our lives, but they'll never take our freedom." The victory at Stirling Bridge sent shockwaves through the British Isles. For the first time in memory, the proud English war machine had been broken, not by a king or an army, but by a commoner from the Scottish countryside. William Wallace, once a hunted outlaw, was now hailed as Guardian and High Commander of Scotland. In the months that followed, Wallace led campaigns deep into enemy territory. English fortresses that had seemed invincible crumbled beneath his fury. Towns like Berwick and Roxburgh fell one by one. The Scots reclaimed their lands, and their spirits rose with every victory. For a brief moment, it seemed Scotland might truly be free. But freedom, Wallace learned, is the most fragile of dreams. The nobles who had joined him in battle soon began to whisper among themselves. Many were loyal to their own power, not to the cause. They feared Wallace's growing influence. After all, he was not of noble birth. He was a man of the people. While Wallace fought for Scotland's soul, others schemed for their own crowns. The great lords of the land, Comyn, Bruce, and others, played their deadly games of politics, seeking favor from both sides. Wallace saw it all but refused to bend. To him, the war was not about wealth or titles. It was about honor, dignity, and freedom. In 1298, King Edward I, the Hammer of the Scots, returned with vengeance burning in his heart. He assembled one of the largest armies Europe had ever seen. Over 25,000 men, armored knights, and archers from Wales and England. He vowed to crush the Scottish rebellion once and for all. Wallace's army met the English near Falkirk. The field was open, the sky heavy with rain. Wallace knew his men were outmatched in armor and weapons, but not in courage. He arranged them in schiltrons, tight circles of spearmen, their long pikes bristling like the quills of a hedgehog. When the English cavalry charged, the ground shook like thunder. Horses screamed as they impaled themselves on Scottish spears. For a moment it seemed the impossible might happen again. But then, betrayal. The Scottish cavalry, led by jealous nobles, fled the field, abandoning Wallace and his men. The English seized their chance. Arrows rained down, tearing through the unarmored Scots. The schiltrons broke. Blood turned the earth to mud. Wallace fought ferociously, cutting through enemies with his great sword, but even his might could not turn the tide. The day was lost. As darkness fell, Wallace withdrew into the forests with the survivors. Thousands lay dead on the field behind him. Falkirk was a massacre. Yet even in defeat, Wallace's legend grew. He became a ghost in the mist, striking English outposts, ambushing supply trains, vanishing into the highlands. He no longer fought with armies, he fought with shadows. But Scotland was fracturing again. The nobles who had once cheered him now sought to negotiate peace with Edward. To them, Wallace had become a threat, a reminder of their cowardice. Slowly, the rebellion he had ignited began to dim. Still, Wallace refused to yield. He carried the dream of freedom like a torch through the darkest nights. To the people, he was still a hero, a living symbol that one man's courage could stand against tyranny. To the English, he was an outlaw, a ghost, a menace that refused to die. And somewhere in the depths of his soul, William Wallace knew the truth. The price of freedom would not be measured in victories, but in sacrifice. After the crushing loss at Falkirk, William Wallace vanished into legend. For years, the English searched for him, scouring the highlands, raiding villages, offering rewards in gold for his capture. Yet none could find him. To many, he had become a myth, a spirit of vengeance haunting the forests of Scotland. But Wallace was no ghost. He moved in silence, always in motion, rallying what remained of his loyal men. By day, he was a shadow in the glen. By night, a whisper among rebels. Wherever the English raised their banners, rebellion followed. Still, the war had changed. Without the unity of the clans, Wallace's struggle grew harder. Many nobles sought peace with King Edward, kneeling to him for land and protection. The very men who had once fought beside Wallace now turned their backs, some out of fear, others out of greed. Meanwhile, Edward's power tightened around Scotland like an iron fist. Fortresses rose, garrisons grew, and spies crept into every town. The once free hills became hunting grounds. Wallace's name was now spoken only in secret, with both reverence and dread. Yet even cornered, he refused to stop. He led ambushes that struck terror into English troops. He freed prisoners, burned supply wagons, and spread chaos wherever he went. The English called him a madman. The Scots called him a savior. In 1304, the rebellion was nearly broken. One by one, the clans surrendered. The noble Robert the Bruce, torn between ambition and loyalty, sought his own claim to power. Wallace, however, stayed true to his vow, to never bow to England no matter the cost. But fate is cruel to those who fight too long against the tide. In 1305, betrayed by one of his own countrymen, a knight named Sir John de Menteith, Wallace was captured near Glasgow. The details are uncertain. Some say he was ambushed while sleeping, others that he was surrounded and overpowered after refusing to flee. What is certain is this, and the man who had defied a king was finally taken in chains. Bound and shackled, Wallace was dragged south across the border to London. Crowds gathered in every village to see the infamous rebel. Children threw stones, priests muttered curses. But some, even among the English, looked on in awe, for they knew they were witnessing something rare, a man unbroken by fear. When he reached London, he was paraded through the streets like a trophy. The people jeered and spat, yet Wallace walked proudly, head held high. His clothes were torn, his body bruised, but his spirit burned brighter than ever. He was taken to Westminster Hall, where a mock trial awaited. The charges were treason and murder. When the judge asked how he would plead, Wallace's answer silenced the room. "I could not be a traitor," he said calmly, "for I owe no allegiance to England." It was not a defense, it was a declaration. His words struck like lightning. He knew the verdict was already decided. There would be no mercy. The sentence was death, but not a quick one. Edward wanted to make an example of him, to remind every Scot of the price of defiance. On August 23, 1305, William Wallace was taken to Smithfield, where thousands gathered to watch the execution. As he was led through the crowd, many expected to see fear in his eyes, but what they saw instead was peace, the calm of a man who had already given everything for his people. And though the end would be brutal, the idea he carried, freedom, could not be killed. Because legends do not die in the flesh. They live on in every heart that dares to dream of liberty. The dawn of August 23, 1305 broke cold and gray over London. The city stirred to life with an uneasy hum. Thousands gathering in the streets, drawn not by joy but by morbid curiosity. Rumors had spread for days. The infamous Scottish rebel William Wallace was to die that morning. The man who had defied England, who had struck fear into armies and kings alike, would face his end. Wallace was dragged from his cell in chains, his body frail from weeks of torture and starvation. But his eyes, fierce and unyielding, told a different story. The guards who escorted him could not meet his gaze. Even bound, he carried a presence that seemed to command the earth beneath him. As he was hauled through the crowded streets toward Smithfield, the jeers of the English mob rose and fell like waves. Some shouted curses, others threw stones, yet many stood in silence, unable to look away, for they sensed they were witnessing something far greater than a man's death. They were witnessing the death of a legend born in defiance. When Wallace reached the scaffold, a hush fell over the crowd. Before him stood the executioner, beside him a priest who whispered final prayers. But Wallace refused the words of absolution. Instead, he looked toward the gray London sky and murmured something that only the wind could hear. The execution began with cruelty that would echo through history. He was hanged but cut down before death could take him. His body was stretched and torn, his flesh marked by the vengeance of an empire. Yet through the agony, he made no sound of surrender. Witnesses swore that his silence was more powerful than any scream. And then came the moment that would immortalize him. Bloodied and broken, Wallace turned his head toward the crowd, toward the heavens, and with the last of his breath spoke a single word: freedom. It was not a cry of despair. It was a command, a promise, a prophecy. Those who heard it never forgot. Even among the English, some trembled. They knew then that they had not executed a traitor. They had created a martyr. His body was torn apart, his head displayed on London Bridge, and his limbs sent to the corners of Britain as a warning. But the warning became a beacon. For in death, Wallace achieved what no sword could. He united the spirit of Scotland. Across the highlands and valleys, whispers of his final words spread like wildfire. Farmers, soldiers, even nobles began to speak his name once more, not with fear but with reverence. Mothers told their children the story of the man who stood against an empire. Ballads were sung in secret, carried by the wind through glens and over lochs. Years later, when Robert the Bruce raised his banner and led Scotland to victory at Bannockburn, his men charged not only for their king but for the ghost who had shown them the way. Wallace's courage became the foundation upon which freedom itself was built. And so, though the man was gone, the legend lived on, in the hearts of all who refused to kneel. For William Wallace was not just a warrior, he was an idea that no tyrant could crush, no executioner could silence. Centuries have passed since that grim morning in Smithfield, yet his voice still echoes across the misty hills of Scotland. When the wind howls through the glens and the heather sways under gray skies, you can almost hear it. That one eternal word carried on the breath of the land itself: freedom. The year was 1297, and the embers of rebellion were turning into a wildfire across Scotland. William Wallace had become more than a man. He was a living symbol of resistance. Farmers, craftsmen, even former nobles began to rally to his banner. His victories in skirmishes and ambushes had humiliated the English garrisons, but Wallace knew something greater was coming. He needed a victory so grand that it would echo through the ages. That opportunity came at Stirling Bridge. The English army, led by the arrogant Earl of Surrey, outnumbered Wallace's men nearly 3-1. They had heavy cavalry, longbowmen, and siege equipment, a war machine designed to crush rebellion. But Wallace saw their weakness. The narrow wooden bridge across the river Forth allowed only a few men to cross at a time. It was a trap waiting to be sprung. As dawn broke, English soldiers began to cross. The river mist rolled thick and heavy, muffling sound and blurring shapes. Wallace raised his hand to the signal. With a deafening roar, the Scots surged forward. Spears leveled, axes swinging. They struck as the bridge groaned under the weight of chaos. Horses and men fell into the river, armor dragging them to their deaths. The English, trapped and panicking, tried to retreat, but the bridge collapsed under the weight of their desperation. Within hours, thousands were dead, the rest fled. The Battle of Stirling Bridge was not just a victory, it was a legend born in blood and courage. Word spread like wildfire. Scotland had struck down the mighty English army. Wallace's name became a rallying cry for freedom across the Highlands and Lowlands alike. For a brief shining moment, it seemed the impossible dream of an independent Scotland was within reach. After Stirling Bridge, Wallace's fame soared beyond measure. The Scottish nobles, long divided by greed and fear, finally united, at least in name, behind him. He was knighted and declared Guardian of Scotland, ruling in the name of the captured King John Balliol. But with leadership came enemies, not just from England but from within. The nobles who once bowed now whispered behind his back. "A commoner cannot rule," they said. "He is no lord, no bloodline, no rightful ruler." But Wallace ignored them. His loyalty was to the people, not the crown. He continued to strengthen his forces and prepare for the inevitable: King Edward's return. Edward I, the Hammer of the Scots, was not a man to forgive humiliation. He gathered a massive army, disciplined, armored, and ruthless, and marched north. Wallace met him head-on at Falkirk in 1298. The Scottish spearmen stood in tight circles. The famous schiltrons, a forest of pikes, braced against the thundering English cavalry. For a time they held. English knights fell impaled, their horses screaming. But then Edward unleashed his longbowmen, deadly, disciplined, and merciless. The sky turned black with arrows. The schiltrons broke, chaos spread. Wallace's army was slaughtered. Betrayed by nobles who fled the field, he was forced to retreat into the forests once more. The dream of freedom seemed to fade, but Wallace did not surrender. He would never surrender. "Every man dies," he once told his men, "but not every man truly lives." After the crushing defeat at Falkirk, William Wallace vanished into the mists of Scotland. To the English, he was a ghost, unseen but always feared. To the Scots, he was a myth still breathing. He roamed from glen to glen, rallying small bands of loyal men, striking English patrols and disappearing before the enemy could react. His sword became a symbol carved into hearts, proof that Scotland's spirit had not been broken. But not all hearts were loyal. The Scottish nobles, seeking peace with King Edward, called Wallace a danger, a threat to their negotiations, their lands, their fragile comfort. They whispered lies in dark halls, poisoning his name. Even as Wallace fought for Scotland's freedom, his countrymen began to turn against him. Still, he pressed on. For years, he moved through forests and highlands, surviving on faith and fire. He crossed the sea to France, seeking support from King Philip, pleading for aid in Scotland's cause. For a moment, it seemed hope might return. But politics ruled Europe, and Wallace was a pawn in a game far greater than swords and kings. He returned home knowing he was hunted. Edward's spies scoured the land, offering gold for information, promising mercy for betrayal. Wallace trusted few. He knew one wrong word could mean death. Yet even in hiding, he wrote letters calling the Scots once more to unity. "I have sworn to defend my country's freedom with my life, and if that life be taken, let my death be my voice." The year was 1305. King Edward's grip on Scotland was tightening. English garrisons occupied every major stronghold. Roads were patrolled. Rewards were posted in every town. William Wallace, traitor to the crown, dead or alive. Among those hunting him was Sir John Menteith, a man once called Wallace's friend. History would remember him as the traitor who sold a nation's hope for gold. But betrayal often begins in silence. A look, a promise, a deal whispered in the dark. One cold night near Glasgow, Wallace sought shelter in a farmhouse. He was weary, his clothes torn, his sword dull from years of battle. He prayed quietly by the fire, unaware that word of his presence had already been sent. Before dawn, armed men surrounded the house. Wallace fought like a lion, cutting down the first attackers, roaring as he swung his blade. But the odds were impossible. He was captured, beaten, bound, and dragged away under cover of night. For Scotland, it was as if the sun had gone out. He was taken to London, paraded through the streets as a warning. Crowds gathered, some jeering, some silent with awe. For Edward, it was a victory of domination. For Wallace, it was the beginning of his final battle. In Westminster Hall, under the eyes of English nobles, William Wallace stood, unbroken, unbowed. Chains clattered around his wrist, but his spirit stood higher than any crown. The charges were read: treason, murder, rebellion. Wallace laughed, a sound that cut through the hall like steel. "I could not be a traitor," he said, his voice steady, "for I owe no allegiance to the King of England. I have never sworn him loyalty. My allegiance is to Scotland and to freedom." The court fell silent. Even his enemies felt the weight of his words. But Edward's justice was not built on truth. The sentence had been decided long before he entered the room. He was condemned to die, and not as a knight, but as a criminal. Dragged through the streets tied to a horse, beaten, mocked, Wallace endured it all without a cry. Witnesses said he looked to the heavens, lips moving in silent prayer. To the end, he carried dignity no sword could take away. On August 23, 1305, William Wallace met his fate at the hands of the English crown. Though condemned as a traitor, he faced his end with unwavering courage and faith. His final moments were marked not by defeat, but by the strength of his spirit, a man who never bowed to tyranny. The King of England believed that by ending Wallace's life, he would end the dream of a free Scotland. But instead, he gave birth to a legend. Wallace's name spread across the Highlands like wildfire, whispered in homes, sung in secret songs, and remembered in the hearts of generations. Even his enemies were forced to acknowledge the truth. William Wallace did not die in chains, he rose beyond them. Years later, Robert the Bruce would carry that same fire into battle, leading Scotland to victory at Bannockburn. And when freedom's banner was raised once again, the spirit of Wallace was there, unbroken, eternal. His words still echo through time, the cry of a man who chose liberty over life. They may take our lives, but they'll never take our freedom.